you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Glynn Torres-Spelliscy. I teach space law at the Pettit College of Law and at the New School. I wanted to thank Patrick and Evan and all of Empire Space on inviting us here today, and congratulations on 5 years, guys. That's a remarkable achievement. What a time to be talking about space. The success of the Artemis mission, I think, really proved that space can be a unifying feature even in times of deep political division. One phrase that I thought was nice that entered the lexicon, the public lexicon, was moonjoy. And I think we all needed a little bit of moonjoy this spring. I like to begin a lot of my space law classes with a Carl Sagan quote from his famous Christmas lectures. He said, "We are at an epochal moment. Our machines and eventually ourselves are going out into space. I believe that the history of our species will never again be the same. We have committed ourselves to space, and I do not think we are about to turn back." And that quote feels really relevant today with all the ambitious plans that we're seeing nations, not just the United States, but nations all over the world, put forward with respect to space. And as space becomes less rare, as more of our industries go into space and it becomes more common, I think when you look at NASA's plans, you can really see that. And just the broader growth of the industry represented by everybody in this room as well. I think the next phase is not just going to be about exploration, it's going to be about developing to scale. Now that does present challenges from a legal perspective, and that's going to be our topic today. The question of our panel is, if commercial activity in space is what's becoming normal, how are our legal, ethical, and governance systems going to adapt? I have a wonderful panel that they put together today. I'm going to introduce them here. We have Tony Lin. Tony is a partner at Cooley, where he leads their space tech and satellite initiative practice, representing new and established satellite and communications companies. Tony also teaches a space law course at the San Francisco campus of the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. Neha Dagley is the principal of Spacemark Legal Advisory, a boutique legal practice providing commercial legal counsel to companies in the space, technology, and emerging industries field. And I think Neha teaches as well. Michael Castle-Miller. Michael has an extensive background in developing special economic zones around the globe, and is the founder of the Lunar Development Cooperative, which is designed to ensure the development of space resources is done responsibly and sustainably. And then down at the end, we have Delane Mayer. She's an instructor at NYU Center for Global Affairs, teaching the university's first graduate course on astropolitics. And she's also a founding member and head of sustainability at Nebula Energy. Her work focuses on advanced technologies that address the climate crisis on Earth while enabling sustainable development off Earth. Now, what we thought we'd do with this panel is we talk about kind of the legal issues in both the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And we're going to start with the short term, thinking about what are the key issues over the next 5 years. And I think two things really stand out right now. First, there's a clear push to move faster on exploration, and particularly on human exploration. And second, the US is going to rely on commercial partnerships to get there. So let's start with the first question, current US priorities in space. Neha, what is Congress telling us about the United States' ambitions in space right now?
So Congress has made...
Push your button.
Right. So Congress has made some pretty significant strides for those who have been following Senate Bill 933. This bill sets the stage for the United States leadership in space for decades to come. It is not only an ambitious legislation, but it is also a landmark legislation. And first, I would encourage everybody in this room to go and find the Cruz-Cantwell bill and read it. It's several hundred pages, but it's worth the read. What I would like to do today is just share briefly a few highlights that have caught my attention. The bill primarily acknowledges that there are foreign countries who are developing exploration capabilities for deep space, and that some of these countries are adversaries of the United States. This is actually acknowledged in the legislation, and it goes into detail about the ILRS and some other factors. And the fact that it acknowledges it simply bolsters the case for the US narrative to have leadership and continued leadership in space. What it also does is acknowledges, and as lawyers this is important, it acknowledges the necessity for US leadership to develop the norms and frameworks for activities happening in deep space as well as on the lunar surface. Further speaks to the capabilities that we're going to need, not just from the government, right, but also from the commercial space sector. We're going to need landing capabilities. We're going to need lunar exploration vehicles. We will need extra vehicular spacesuits for the lunar surface. It also does a very good job in identifying that the government does not want to rely on a single operator to fill any of these requirements, right? Because when you rely on a single operator, a private operator, you're setting yourself up for failure. So the bill is very comprehensive, it's very in-depth, and I'm saving the best part for last, and I'm sure most of you have read about it in the news, is it actually talks about a lunar surface moon base to be developed for a permanent crewed United States presence capable of long duration habitation and operations. And it goes even a step further and says continuous capability to a permanently occupied or continued inhabited lunar presence. This is something that we've never seen in legislation before, and it is one to watch, and it gives a very strong signal from the government and aligns with all of the policies that we've been seeing coming out of the White House, as well as on the international stage, which I'll now pass it on to the other panelists to speak on.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, obviously Congress isn't the only player in this field. While Artemis was still in space, we of course got the 2027 presidential budget request. And I think it's probably a bit of an understatement to say it caused some consternation in the community. The budget request is very similar to the last request that Congress rejected, which calls for basically a 25% cut across all of NASA's programs and a 50% cut to the science program. Now, Congress's initial reaction has been cold. Both Republicans and Democrats have indicated that they're not interested in passing such a budget. But there is a practical reality here, and that is that until Congress acts, NASA has to act like the presidential budget request is what they're going to be dealing with. And we saw this in 2025 as well, when President Trump first issued his presidential budget request that drastically cut NASA, is NASA had to scale back programs. They had to release employees. And then when Congress came in all these months later and said, no, we are going to fund NASA, they had to ramp up again. So what happens when you get this budget request is you put NASA almost in a state of paralysis. I fully think that eventually Congress is going to come in and fund NASA at the same level. In fact, the Cruz-Cantwell version of the bill has a 2.5% increase for the fiscal year 2027. But until that becomes law, NASA's operating in a little bit of an inefficient state because they don't know exactly what their budget is going to be, which programs will survive. Now they do obviously have a very ambitious plan. I don't know if any of you watched the Ignition event. It was in late March where Administrator Isaacman got up and gave what I thought was a remarkable vision for human exploration and building bases on the moon. I mean, they're talking about sending hundreds of thousands of tons of material to the moon in the next 5 years. That is a lot of opportunity for the people in this room. NASA is about to become, I think, a very good customer. That bodes well for industry. You know who else it bodes well for is lawyers. There will be a lot of lawyer work involved in getting up there. The problem is growth rarely comes without risks. When industry scales, law often lags, and that's a problem. Regulatory regimes are incomplete and unclear, and as capital rushes in, all the industry is going to have to think about how to manage those uncertainties. And let me bring Tony into this conversation. Tony, for years operators have been conducting, or operators who are conducting novel space activities have been working in kind of a legal void with no clear authorization pathway. The Department of Commerce just released a proposal meant to address that gap. Does it close the gap, or does it just create a set of new questions?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Glenn. Let me just start with just a minor tweak to your question about legal void. So having authorized or gotten authorizations for many clients in the last several years, I think it would be our position that there's not a legal void, that they have all the authorizations they need to do whatever they are doing in space. And I think that's actually the position also of the regulatory agencies. That their position is essentially that although it's not clear exactly how you trace the lines, that the authorizations that you do have are sufficient to meet the ongoing Outer Space Treaty Act of continuing supervision. So the proposal you're talking about from the Office of Space Commerce, which is still just in discussions, is largely to clarify how exactly we are meeting those obligations of continuing supervision. And I think as many of you know, this has been an ongoing effort for many years to try to make clear exactly how we are honoring our international obligations with respect to activities in space. And this is the latest effort. It seems to be getting some traction, although it has been floating around for a month or two, and there's been at least one iteration. But the idea is that the Office of Space Commerce would set up a certification type process, which would be very light touch. It would have a 120-day clock. Applicants could come in on a voluntary basis and say, hi, we're doing this really novel space activity. We're going to do something that no one else has done before, and it is more than what the FCC authorizes in terms of radio frequency communications. It is more than what NOAA CRISRA authorizes in terms of imaging of the satellites. It is more than what the FAA does in terms of launch and reentry. So we're asking you, is our activity that's more than that also permissible under US law? And the idea would be the Office of Space Commerce would take it back to this kind of interagency discussion behind the scenes. They would fast track it, they would discuss with those interested parties, and then you would get your result back as in a yay or nay. The idea being you certify that you're going to do primarily comply with 4 major criteria. Let's see if I remember all these, but it's like adherence to national security requirements, consistency with foreign policy, safety, orbital safety, and then I think there's one more, but it's escaping me right now. So if you certify to all those obligations, then they will take a review as well, and then they will honor that certification. And in theory, this would be used in conjunction with the other licensed authorizations that you need. It doesn't replace FCC, it doesn't replace NOAA, it doesn't replace FAA. You have to get those as well. But this is kind of like filling in or making more clear that you have all the authorizations you need. So I think it's a good effort, kind of bring it all home. It's a good effort, it's a step in the right direction, and it's really just kind of buttoning up and making sure that you as a company and your investors are comfortable that whatever you're proposing in space is covered by these activities, or covered by these authorizations.
And I think we're about to see probably a rush, Tony, of these new applications. Do you think government is ready? Do we think the regulators are ready for what's coming?
That's a good question. I don't know, because in my experience, they're almost never ready. So, that's kind of probably a little glib, but I don't know all the activities that are waiting on the sidelines ready to come in. We've already seen some, like the data centers in space. Those parties that have filed, there have been at least 3, have been willing to try to go through the current process, which is go get your FCC license, go get the other authorizations that you need. They're willing to push that forward rather than wait around for the OSC process to come about.
And are Just on the bill, a question from me. Are the other agencies, like have the FAA and FCC, have they commented on this new certification? Are they on board with this?
So, very good question. A lot of what the OSC has proposed really relies on those other agencies, other government agencies, agreeing that there is value to the OSC process. So if you make the certification that you're going to comply with orbital debris requirements or safety requirements, that's going to be sufficient also for example, the FCC, which actually currently has authority to regulate orbital debris mitigation. And they've not said a word. They've not publicly said a word. So it's unclear how exactly that plays into things if the OSC ever gets their process established. I think the worst case scenario would be they create this process, FCC, FAA, and NOAA CRISRA decide, yeah, we're not gonna respect this process. You still have to do the exact same things you need to do for us, which makes this kind of voluntary process largely useless, because then you're just doing one more thing that you need to do in order to get authorized, and that's not helping anybody.
Let me bring Delane in on this as well. Delane, as launch and deorbit activity scales, what environmental impacts do we see emerging? And how should companies be thinking about these risks in the absence of clear regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the industry is basically too large at this point to claim that there are no environmental impacts. Maybe prior to kind of the advent of SpaceX and reusable rockets and the launch cadence that we see today, we could ignore this question, but launch cadence has basically tripled since 2019. In 2019, there were 100 launches that year. In 2025, we had 300, and this is growing kind of exponentially. So again, the environmental question is too big to overlook. There are kind of three components to it. There's the terrestrial siting question. So launch facilities, spaceports have vast environmental impact. Most federal land is incredibly biodiverse. Cape Canaveral is actually the most biodiverse federal property in the country, and so every time there is a launch, there is the fuel expenditure, there is the noise pollution. All of this, as we increase that launch cadence, is going to have an increasingly potentially detrimental impact on local community. And there's also this kind of neo-colonial element of it as well. Both private companies, the US government, other countries utilize spaceports closer to the equator for some of the orbital mechanics benefits of that. In countries that have less stringent environmental requirements than what the US requires. And so there's this question around terrestrial impact and are we replicating some of the neo-colonial relationships of the 20th century and replicating that with space infrastructure. So that's the terrestrial side. We have the orbital debris question and what we do at a satellite's end of life. We are increasingly finding heavy metals in the atmosphere, aluminum, lithium, copper, all of this. We thought we kind of dealt with the ozone question, but it seems to be coming back around. Again, this is inconsequential when we have just dozens of launches per year, but as we scale and push towards hundreds, if not 1,000 launches per year, we really need to start thinking about end of life, and what that looks like from kind of the design principle side is thinking about propulsion, thinking about materials, thinking about, again, the launch siting and where that's happening and what the physical impact of that is. And then the third piece is kind of this idea of sacrifice zones. So we see this a lot in manufacturing, in the energy industry, which I work in as my kind of 9 to 5. I otherwise moonlight in geopolitics for space. But this question about what lands are we comfortable sacrificing in order to have industrial and manufacturing productivity output, economic productivity. And so all of this is kind of a trade-off when we think about the environmental question. And I think part of that is also what does global South inclusion look like in the environmental question? So as more and more countries utilize space-based services, what kind of say does the global South have in determining the regulations, the environmental requirements needed for both launch capacity and end-of-life disposal?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting issue, how we kind of integrate all these increased launches into kind of our current communities. One of my students works for the US Coast Guard, and his job is to kind of tell fishermen that they cannot go out into the sea at a certain time because there's a launch happening. And as more and more launches happen, these fishermen, these fishing communities are seeing more dramatic impacts on their livelihood, and trying to figure that out is going to be really important. If the pace of growth in the industry, if it continues, we're going to see a great deal of capital flowing into the sector, and investors are always looking for the next growth opportunity. And space has a lot of very attractive ingredients, but public markets, as lawyers well know, can be unforgiving. They reward optimism on the way up, and then they punish missed timelines, failed missions, or overpromised projections on the way down. Neha, you wrote about the Firefly litigation in your space-marked files, and I read that piece. And what should space sector operators be thinking about in terms of legal risks when they begin to access these capital markets?
So Firefly, it's an amazing company. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of it. And before I comment on the litigation itself that's pending, these are allegations that are being made in a class action. Securities litigation, none of it has been proven. Firefly, again, I said, is an amazing company. They've been doing very difficult things in space, but now they're faced with a securities class action. Essentially what happened in this case is they IPO'd, I think in August of 2025, at around $45 per share. By the time the lawsuit was filed, it had dropped to, I think, $19. And what the lawsuit alleges is that there were materially misleading statements that were made that were violations of securities statutes. And primarily the complaint relies on public-facing statements that were made in investor calls, in press releases, on the website of Firefly Aerospace. If you go and look at the S1, right, S1s are very comprehensive, registration statements are very comprehensive. They identify a lot of risk factors, and in this case, the S1 did just that. It identified a lot of space-related risk factors, as a registration statement should do. Yet, the securities litigation is now pending. Whether or not it's successful, we don't know. But I think a broader lesson that we can take away from all of this, and it's not necessarily for companies that are looking to go public, but it's any sort of startup company that's looking to get capital, right? Make sure that your public-facing statements are vetted by a lawyer. Make sure before you make aspirational statements, because space is a very aspirational thing, right? You're excited about it, you want to talk about it. You may want to say we have flight heritage, we're orbit ready, we're commercially available. Make sure those types of descriptions are grounded in facts and are provable and are vetted by counsel, because sometimes we can get ahead of ourselves. And another thing about the securities litigation is it's not just the company that's being sued, it's also the directors and officers. So when you sign off on something, it's important to make sure that it's, again, grounded in facts. And there has been some discussion over the course of the week about, at what point do you get counsel involved? Is it too early to get counsel involved sometimes? And my position on that would be, no, it's never too early. You want to get the right counsel who has their pulse on what's happening in the litigation side of things, on the regulatory side of things, and even knows the folks who they can call up within the industry to find out niche areas that they don't themselves understand. And you want somebody who's embedded in your company from the very get-go, so they understand what your company does, and they can grow with you and help you grow without making those mistakes and taking those heavy litigation risks that you would have maybe if you have intermittent counsel. So there's always a broader lesson here. As we're going to have more commercial space companies doing business, there is going to be more litigation and not just securities litigation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Neha, because I know there's probably an incentive to kind of build up the business as much as you can in order to sell it. But you got to be careful in a high-risk industry.